and presenting on advancing equitable food systems through evidence-based policy. And we're really lucky to have Sabrina Adler and Nessia Berner Wong present for us. So I'll hand it off to you two.
So if you want to do your intro.
Yeah. Well, I'm Nessia. I'm policy analyst at ChangeLab Solutions. Before joining ChangeLab, I worked mostly on our food systems policy there and like a smattering of other random stuff, like overdose prevention and tribal work. My career before that was with the USDA Food and Nutrition Service, working on child nutrition programs in the regional office out west, so doing a lot of grant administration and management, MPA for the west coast of the United States and the outer Pacific Islands. So that's my background and where I come from. And then before I jump into ChangeLab,
Sure. Yeah, I'm Sabrina, as you said. I am an attorney at ChangeLab. I have been there for about 6 years. I've lost track. Somewhere between 6 and 7, I think. And I work across a number of our portfolios as well, but with respect to food, have mostly focused on food marketing, broadly defined, which I will talk about, and sugary drinks work. My background before coming to ChangeLab was actually more in direct legal services. I was doing legal aid at SF General in a pediatric clinic there.
And before I talk about ChangeLab and then go into sort of some of our topics for discussion today, are folks familiar with ChangeLab? That's like, okay, middle of the road. We are a nonprofit. We work on law and policy, public health law and policy, but we more broadly just talk about advancing equitable laws and policies for health. We are focused on communities that are at highest risk for poor health and focus on sort of undoing the harms that law and policy might have created under structural racism and other forms of institutionalized discrimination that burden some of these communities. So we're obviously spend a lot of time using research and using that to translate into law and policy and to do capacity building for communities that are interested in using law and policy to address health inequities. And so we'll talk a little bit today about how we balance the evidence base with sort of the other contexts in which we operate, which are the values of and needs of the communities that we work in, as well as just the legal landscape that obviously has an influence on the law. And before diving in, to give you a sense of sort of our approach, we're founded, as I said, sort of in this fundamental understanding that laws and policies have been used to promote the health of people, but have also not done that for everyone and actually negatively impacted a lot of people. So communities of color, low-income communities, and other marginalized groups are disproportionately affected by discriminatory practices and policies that lead to poor health. So we are working sort of to alter these systems that keep inequity in place and sort of focus on these broad fundamental drivers of health inequity. That's disparities in opportunity, structural discrimination, income inequality and poverty, disparities in political power, and governance that limits meaningful participation. And I brought with, if folks are interested, we sort of just like put a thing out that sort of describes this and is sort of our new, compass for how we work. So I've got some copies if folks are interested in like learning sort of more about our approach in general, and that really informs sort of like how we talk about research and how we talk about law and how we talk about health. So any questions about that and sort of our like general approach to public health before we dive in? All right. So as I said, we're an evidence-based law and policy organization. We really don't talk about law and policy outside of the context of the evidence that exists. We use the research and we use the evidence to identify what are issues, what are problems, what are successful solutions to those, and what's effective, and looking at the root causes. That said, given sort of this foundational understanding that I described, we also know that the existing frameworks for policy development are favoring people with political, economic, and sort of expert power. And these people with those types of power aren't necessarily committed to the communities that are affected most, and are most often not the communities that are affected most by these laws and policies or intended targets of our work. When I say expert power, I'm talking about NPI, I'm talking about ChangeLab people and groups that are given sort of the go-ahead to be experts on certain topics and provide context and background and really get to shape the narrative around either issues or how those issues are addressed. So because of this, we have historically and still do have law and policy systems that perpetuate disparities, that perpetuate economic, social, environmental systems that perpetuate disparities instead of disrupting them as we would like to do. And this isn't necessarily like laws that are 100% bad. There are a lot of laws that are well-meaning but do have unintended consequences, and you can get into a debate about calling them unintended, but we're going to skip that for today. But some examples of this, like for SNAP, work requirements and asset limits in nutrition assistance programs. SNAP is a really important and significant program. Don't have to say that to this group, and critical to sort of bringing people out of poverty, addressing food insecurity, but can also be harmful in other ways. Laws that criminalize mobile vending. Mobile vending is a really integral sort of middle step for a lot of folks that don't have resources or assets to open up a brick and mortar business. Can also be a way to get healthy foods into less accessible neighborhoods. But the way that those spaces are regulated can also be detrimental and harmful to the people involved in them. Food safety laws is another example of this. Obviously, food safety is important. We don't want to get sick and die from our food. We want to be able to know where it comes from in case something does happen. But some of the regulatory requirements around food safety laws can be burdensome for the folks in the food system that have the least amount of resources and are sort of most on the edge, micro, small, and medium-sized farmers who actually make the least amount of income from their businesses. And I don't know if you're listening or should I keep going?
No, go ahead.
And so the evidence base that is built by, the evidence base and the narrative that is built by these sort of subject matter experts, ourselves, can at times sort of exclude the lived experiences and community values that are happening on the ground, and doesn't always show the multiple and compounding factors that contribute to a problem. For an example that reflects on our work, physical food access, this was a huge part of our food portfolio for a very long time. We worked on physical food access as an obesity prevention strategy. It was a core part of obesity prevention work for our organization, healthy retail gardens, farmers markets. By no means a bad thing, but when we're out in communities, this isn't always a top priority for them, and it's not always for them the biggest deterrent to a healthy diet. I was in Sacramento for training with a group of folks representing counties around California. Sorry, baby heartburn. We were talking about healthy food access, and they said that to be honest, our biggest barrier is that we have a lot of violence in our community, and the decision makers in our communities don't see structural discrimination or racism as a core issue. So, what is a farmers market going to do for that? We were down working with an organization in Stockton with a community resident group, and they were funded to do farmers market work. Great thing. healthy foods is, you know, an important part of public health approach, but this community was just, to be honest, not interested in farmers markets because they had housing issues, transportation issues, income issues. So as we're sort of approaching communities and working communities, we have to take into account that although the funding and what we're asked to do is often influenced by sort of this narrative that is created around, you know, what are the issues, that we have to balance that with what folks on the ground are saying is an issue for them and is important to them, and really take into account that all these issues are intersectional and compounding, that you can't talk about food without talking about housing, without talking about income, without talking about transportation. And some examples of that, we worked with the city of Miami Gardens, which is a city in Florida, who is interested in a healthy food procurement policy. Procurement's one of the areas that I work on, but they were interested as a city in how they could influence the health of their citizens and their residents by ensuring that the food that was being provided either on their property, at the sports games, through city-run kids programs, senior programs, was healthy. But a big concern of theirs was that they were a small community. They supported a lot of small and local vendors through their institutional purchasing and really did not want to impact the business or the income of those vendors by, you know, making a sudden change to some healthier food service guidelines. So we worked with them to engage the vendors, engage the folks that would be most impacted, and create a healthy procurement program ordinance that took into account the fact that people were making their livelihoods off of this, these contracts, and that if you were to change the requirements in such a drastic way that these businesses could not respond to the contracts, could not be in business with the city anymore, that would create an income issue for those folks, and, you know, again, cause potentially food insecurity problems for them, while you're at the same time trying to provide healthy food for consumers. So that's an example of sort of like how we see the food system and how we work with communities and folks that come to us, you know, with an interest in law and policy to address food system issues, to sort of balance between, we know, bottom line, healthier food and beverages is really important to folks' health, allows them to, you know, go to work, take care of their kids, but that intersects with a lot of other needs and issues that sort of cycle back to be integrated into the food system again. So we have to look at all those pieces and really listen and incorporate that as we're doing our work. I think I'll pause there. I know there's a lot of interest in beverages. And maybe you can talk a little about the context of the law. And I have a little more on like how we view food systems in general and food systems values, but I think I'll put that on pause and then we can add that later if that makes sense.
Sure. Questions or thoughts before I dive in? Okay. So I'm going to add another layer on top of what Nessia was talking about, which is that everything that we do is grounded in the evidence. We also try to ensure that everything we do is grounded in sort of community desires and needs, but you also have to layer on top of that when you're talking about policy, and particularly what we call big P policy, so changing the law, what the legal system allows in this country, and that is not always a totally straightforward thing. So, for example, if you think about the food marketing space, we might get input that a particular community is saturated with unhealthy food advertisements. We can look at what the research says about the way that that affects people's purchasing patterns, eating behaviors, wants and needs, and also in like the longer term their health, and decide that we want to do something about that. But in order to figure out how we're going to do something about that, we also need to understand, like, what the law in this country, and by the law I mean the Constitution, the statutes we have at the federal level and the state level, and the ordinances we have at the local level allow us to do. And it's not, it is usually not as simple as just saying, research tells us that community doesn't want, like, get rid of. There is also, as you well know, like, a political context in which we have to work, and that varies, like, greatly from place to place across the country. So just even if we've arrived at that approach that is taking into account what the community wants and needs, what the research says the problem is, and what the law allows, like, that doesn't just automatically translate into a successful policy. So we at ChangeLab sort of operate in this legal integrity, legal innovation, legal intervention framework, where by integrity we're talking about what does the law say and what is the, like, real legal and policy world that we're working in here. Then the innovation piece being, like, how can we work within those confines and actually be creative and do something about it, and then the intervention is, like, what are we actually going to do on the ground. So I'm going to talk some more specifically about the marketing space, and I can talk about sugary drinks too, because if that's of interest. But so take food marketing. We know it's a problem. We particularly know that various types of marketing, particularly for unhealthy foods, target specifically and often purposefully low-income communities, communities of color. What can we do about that? Well, we have in this country the First Amendment, which I'm sure you are all familiar with, and for better or for worse, it protects not only what you and I go out into the street and say about whatever politician or issue or artistic work we want to say something about, but it also protects what corporations say. And the initial impetus for that, like back in the 70s, was actually not like an evil corporations are amazing impetus, but rather we need to protect and allow the free flow of information to consumers so that they can be informed and make decisions, and by sort of censoring what corporations are saying, there's not that free flow. So it's really more about the listener. Over the past 40 or so years, as I'm sure is not a surprise to any of you, that has shifted a little bit, I think partially intentionally and partially in just sort of like a shift with the political winds, et cetera, to be just overall more protective of corporations and what they can do and say. There is also an increasing I don't know what the right word is, but like move, like again, intentionally I think on behalf of corporations, but to define like everything as speech. So it's not just like what they're actually saying in terms of written word and words coming out of their mouth, but things that they are doing that could be sort of considered communication, but that aren't necessarily speech. Now, the law hasn't gone quite that far to, like, make it so that we can't regulate anything in that space, but this is the world that we, and when I say we, I mean those of us working in policy around food marketing, are operating in. It can be very challenging, but that's where the innovation piece comes in, and that is where we start to think about marketing very broadly, and not just as the speech, but what other activities are happening that are influencing how people are eating, purchasing, et cetera. So that might be something like price, which a company is going to argue is also communicative, but for now, at least, the law is pretty clear that that's not communication. There might be other reasons why you can't regulate price, but what does that leave on the table? It leaves things like taxes, minimum pricing, strategies that would address that piece of thing. Now, that piece of the puzzle. Now, on the back end of that, we always have this community piece coming, that might cut in the opposite direction. And when we're talking about taxes, then we also want to think about, are they regressive, and is this actually going to have intended or unintended negative consequence? Can come back. I'm just going to table that for a second. But so we think about price, we can think about things like place. So a lot of the things that, like Nessia said, we've done traditionally have been about where are things in the community, what's located, like even within the store, can we think about where something is on the shelf? So one of the things that we've thought about is like healthy checkout aisles. It's not really, I mean, companies will argue, and they are probably right, that that is a form of communication, and they are trying to get you to do something as a result of where something is placed in the store. But there are also other reasons to regulate that. It is obviously not speech as we sort of traditionally define speech. So is that an avenue? Kids' meals is another avenue where we ended up trying to get at a way that you could regulate sort of the marketing in the fast food context without directly regulating sort of the posters that are on the wall, the ads you see on TV, all of which is very difficult to do. So can you just regulate what's actually being offered in the store, and the business practice, which is a marketing practice of bundling together certain products without really giving people, shaping people's choices based on what's actually being offered as a package without them having to think twice about what it is, and change that default situation so that what they're actually getting without thinking is something that's healthy rather than something that's unhealthy. So that I could keep giving a million examples of that, but that's kind of the general world that we work in and the ways that we kind of navigate around the edges of what is allowable given the law. And there's a whole other project that one could work on, which is much more difficult, which is changing that context. But I think in the context of the Supreme Court that we have today, for better or for worse, we are working in a world that is not going to change anytime soon in terms of being less protective of corporations. So that is what we're up against. Let me pause there, see if folks have questions, thoughts. Yes.
So how do you handle, obviously you saw earlier this year there was that whole push for preemption around soda tax laws, and I know preemption is like a huge issue around public health efforts, and so obviously as lawyers that's something that's very familiar, so I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to how you guys navigate that.
Yeah, this was one of the things on my list to get to, and I will just talk about it now, and we can keep talking about it. Yes, preemption is a huge problem. Does everyone know what preemption is? Okay, I'll just give like a brief. Preemption is basically the legal concept that higher levels of government, a law from a higher level of government, I used to say trumps, but that's not a word that I'm going to use to describe this anymore, takes precedence over the law of a lower level of government. So the federal government can preempt state and local law, and states can preempt local law. There are limitations on that, but that's the basic concept. What happened in California last year, as I'm sure all of you know, was this like blackmail, basically, where industry introduced this horrible ballot measure and then used that as a bargaining chip to force the legislature to preempt sugary drink taxes in localities in California for a period of, I think, 12 years. That is a page straight out of the tobacco industry's playbook. They have been doing that for ages. And the tobacco policy and advocacy world quickly, well, maybe not quickly, but has learned how to fight back somewhat. It is very difficult because of the amount of money that these corporations have. They realized long ago in the tobacco context that it is much easier to fight things once at the state level than it is to fight things in every little city around the country. And cities have traditionally been places where a lot of these more progressive public health policies happen. So this is not only an issue in public health, it's in a bunch of other, like minimum wage is a huge one, paid sick leave and sort of employment policies. We've seen it in like the LGBTQ and just civil rights more broadly protection context, environmental stuff, so like straws, plastic bags, fracking, and it all ties back directly to, well,
in some ways at least, to this corporate speech, protection of corporate speech, and Citizens United and the ability of corporations to play in the political world and pay for both policy approaches, but also specific legislators' ability to be elected and then be beholden to them. And there was a direct uptick in preemption following Citizens United in 2010. That's when this sort of exploded. So in terms of what's being done in that context, there's a couple of different things. I will say it is very difficult. I personally spend like half my time working on preemption right now. There is more coordination happening across issues, which is helpful. People are more aware of it. When I say people, I mean advocates working to advance progressive policies, whether it's in public health or otherwise. People are also more aware of the need to work across issues so that we are not just sitting siloed, like we're working on sugary drink taxes and we have no idea what's going on in the tobacco world or employment protections or whatever else it might be, and that we need to be working across issues. A lot of the stuff is happening like behind closed doors at the last minute. It's really hard to get ahead of, but people are more aware, I think. The other thing that's happening is an effort to actually communicate to the public about what's happening, and there is more sort of cross-party and cross the political spectrum, like, agreement on an understanding of this, like, need to allow local governments to have authority and power, like, regardless of the issue, because they are the government closest to the people, which ironically is like a very Republican conservative philosophy, which goes completely out the door when that cuts against those lawmakers on like the particular issue that they are working on. Because the reality is, like, right now in the political climate, their cities, for the most part, are much more liberal than the states in which they sit. So the state government as a whole, or legislature, is much more conservative than the lawmaking body at the local level. Yeah?
Is that bipartisan agreement specific to California, or have you noticed it across other states as well?
The polling that's been done, and this is, the legislators are not in this place yet because it's still happening and they are being paid by the corporations, but the general public, this is national polling. It's not just California. However, I'll flag and then I take questions and stuff. I could go on about this for an hour, but the one thing I want to flag is that one thing we are working on at ChangeLab and want to be really careful to flag is that this effort to sort of push back blanket against preemption and label it as a bad thing, like across the board, fails to take into account some of the nuance, which the more conservative side is just owning. Like I just said, they don't care. Their interest is not actually in preemption. It's in achieving a specific policy goal, and that's the mechanism by which they are doing it. I think there's, particularly in public health, which has been scarred, rightly so, by the tobacco world, like, experience with this, the sort of knee-jerk, like, preemption bad, must always counter it. But if you think back to, like, the civil rights era, for example, a lot of the really problematic stuff that was happening at the local level. And it was actually states and the federal government that stepped in and said, no, like, we're going to actually set a floor here or do something about this and prevent you guys from going rogue and discriminating and setting up all these discriminatory and racist structures that you are working on because you, locality, are actually causing the problem here. So that's not exactly the political era that we're in, but it is not even remotely, like, out of the question that localities, even now today, could be doing some problematic things, and there's a role for the state or the federal government to step in and say either, no, like, we're taking away your power completely in this area, or we're going to set a floor. I'll just give one example. So there's this thing called 911 nuisance laws. Are you guys familiar with that? It's basically the concept that if you call 911 too many times for, like, domestic violence reasons or because of public safety issues in your neighborhood, that you could be deemed a nuisance, and if you do it 3 times, you can be evicted from your house. Obviously, that's problematic on many levels, but there were a bunch of cities that were passing laws like that, and there have been states now that have stepped in and preempted those sorts of laws. Now, I would argue, and I guess most of you guys would too, that that's a good thing. So to just say that there should always be sort of unbridled local control and we don't really have an opinion about the outcome of that, I think is not totally true. And so we at ChangeLab, we've just published an article about this, or it's about to be published, and we are trying to sort of introduce that more nuanced take on it. And one place where research comes into this is there's really not a lot of research on the actual effects of preemption. You can presume that it is a bad thing in certain contexts and a good thing in others, but we are trying to work with the research community also to get more folks to take a real empirical look at the effects of some of these laws, so that that can be used both for communications purposes and in developing policies.
Yeah, I'm sure folks here are familiar with the Safe Sidewalk Vending Act that passed, was it this year or last year in California? That's another example of there were municipalities that were criminalizing sidewalk vending, and though not the perfect solution, is an important step to require cities, like, you have to set up some type of process around this. You can't just criminalize folks for doing this, and have yet to see the effects. Would love to know if anyone's looking at it, because we haven't found a lot of municipalities that have actually done anything more than put in new boilerplate language just to come into compliance. But another example of how the state said, we're gonna tell you what minimum you have to do and sort of what you can't do, and then go from there.
Right. That said, to tie it back to your initial inquiry, like, I think everyone is in agreement that what went down here in terms of sugary drink taxes was hugely problematic. We are working on potential legal challenges. There's also a coalition of folks working to, through the political process, potentially repeal that bill. So we could dive more into that if folks want more.
I'm actually wondering, in the initial stages of that, how did they get enough signatures to get that onto the ballot?
Because you can pay for signatures, and they have a lot of money.
Okay.
So California's ballot initiative system is basically set up so that the legislature, the easiest way to get something on the ballot is just to gather signatures. And if you have enough money and pay people $10 or whatever it is per signature, and it turns out it's not that complicated to get enough signatures, which is why we have, like, crazy crowded ballots a lot of the time, sometimes with things that are like, why are we voting on this? So they used that as a tool to then get in the room to negotiate with, but it wasn't even really a negotiation, it was like a demand, I would say. I don't know if anyone else watched some of the hearings that went on, and it was basically like 3 days from when we as an advocacy community found out this was happening and when they passed the law. And they live streamed lots of legislative sessions, and they were infuriated, the lawmakers, but there was nothing they could do. And from an equity perspective, I've gotten into arguments, is overstating the case, but there is some disagreement about whether they should have caved to this or not, but it would have been far more devastating on a global scale, and including taking into account, like, the equity perspective on this, which some people are, to pass, for that ballot initiative to have passed. Would it have passed? No one knows, but the risk is too great.
So I just want to swing back to the work that you guys are doing with kind of ground truthing, if you will, the work that you're doing in communities. And so the tax issue, of course, is always this big boogeyman. And, Republicans say taxes, people get freaked out, everyone gets freaked out, and then they kind of get their way. So how do you guys address an issue like that?
Yeah, that's a good, do you want to say anything on that?
Why don't you do tax stuff first, and then
I'll
add more.
Yeah, so for taxes, I mean, I don't have a perfect answer. I would say this is an ongoing conversation in the advocacy community. There are groups that are constantly convening to talk about this and responding to. So there's two issues. There's, like, the actual facts of what these policies do, and they are actually regressive, taxes by definition are regressive. Now, the marketing practices of the companies are also regressive. The disease burden is regressive. There is certainly a way to distribute the revenue that is not regressive, and that is sort of where the conversation is in the advocacy community. And then there's a communications piece, which is like the industry is very savvy. They get out in front of everyone. They have their sound bites. They switch them up based on what the particular concerns are in the community. So, you know, right now in California, their big thing is like the cost of living. This is just it's part of one of many things making everything more expensive, which even the most like tax favorable, progressive, hates soda, loves public health person, like, it's expensive to live here. I'm not going to deny that. So I think the first piece is, like, actually figuring out being aligned as a advocacy and policy community around the policy goals and making sure that we know based on research and experience that the policy is designed in a way that we can genuinely counter some of those arguments, but then also figuring out and involving the community in that piece. So it's not just, you know, us sitting around a table figuring this out, but really like getting input from the people that are going to be most affected by it. And then figuring out how do you communicate that in a way that gets ahead of and can counter some of the often misleading and sometimes false messages of the industry.
Yeah, I mean, I think that hits it on the head. I mean, in a non-tax related example, I think that when we see, for example, California, I think spent like 8+ years trying to get rid of the maximum family cap in CalWORks, which is, you know, extremely racist and discriminatory policy that punishes generally, or is based on the assumption that poor people and people of color who are requiring assistance shouldn't have, you know, are having too many kids and, you know, bleeding the government dry, all of that, and could not get benefits if they had more children in their families. Anyway, seems like a really easy win to get rid of that. It was not. It took a really long time, and in California, the thing that changed it and really changed public opinion and changed the opinion of policymakers was when the advocacy groups that were working towards this had originally just been anti-poverty and anti-hunger groups, which at the time still are largely led by white people, brought in the reproductive justice community, which was led by people of color and led by the people that were most impacted by this rule. And they were able to reframe the issue in a way that made it palatable to communities and also very persuasive for policymakers. And that was the turning point at which they were able to make the change. So I think this bringing communities and communities that represent the intended targets or the intended recipients or the people that are most affected by these changes is really critical to sort of affecting change. And then the communication, how that message is communicated is, you know, I think a perpetual mind game for...
It's hard to keep control over it. They have a lot of money, and money can buy really smart communications people who do a great job just spreading a message that is not one that we agree with or that is even necessarily factually correct. That doesn't seem to matter these days. So.
No, and we talk about sort of the commercial determinants of health now because, I mean, this money and industry and these businesses and corporations that have power, that have the funds to do this are impacting health on individual and community levels.
Both health and policy. So they're impacting not just through their direct practices, but also through their seat at the table by changing the policy context in which we're all trying to operate.
I wonder if you guys could talk a little bit more.
Okay, you next.
If you guys could talk a little bit more about how you sort of discern what the community wants, how you sort of find that community voice.
I think it depends. A lot of it, I mean, I think we spend a lot of time doing relationship building. We have developed some processes. One of the most recent ones that I can think of is we do a lot of work in Oklahoma with the Tobacco Settlement Endowment Trust, which is tobacco money, and they use a lot of it for obesity prevention, and had asked ChangeLab to help them. They have a healthy living program and give out money to grantees to do work in communities, and had asked ChangeLab to do sort of this year-long training program for those grantees on sort of like strategies and policies for healthy living. And we spent not me, but folks at our organization spent the first year doing focus groups with those grantees in the communities to find out what implementation of healthy living program strategies was like, how it went, what residents, what worked, what didn't, what residents wanted, how they identified priority populations, did that work. So even before going into, we're going to do a year-long training, was a year of focus groups and sort of like on-the-ground work to understand sort of what was currently being done, what was working in what communities, sort of how they reacted to that and how it went down. So that's one example of sort of just, and that required TSET saying like, okay, we'll give you money to do that. But that's just one example of how we sort of took that step first before diving into any actual work.
No, the only other thing I'll add is, like, we don't always have the resources or people power or knowledge to do some of that work. That's not kind of our core area of expertise. So the other piece is finding the right people to partner with who either already have that information or know how to get it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, certainly. Like, we do some tribal work, but tribal law is not our area of expertise. We don't have anyone on staff that does tribal law, and so we have worked with a variety of different partners that do have expertise in that and can go out and meet with tribal communities and tribal nations and tribal governments to really understand that. And we end up sort of like passing through the money that we get to them just to make sure that somebody who actually knows what they're doing is doing this work, and we're not spending all our time trying to figure it out or making incorrect assumptions about what the needs and requirements are. I know you've been waiting.
In terms of marketing, there are two areas I'm hoping you could update.
Sure.
One is specifically the issue of marketing to children, and that one's always felt to me like there feels like there should be some potential to move the needle there, and so just what kind of work is happening there and how that's going. And then the other one is around the tax deductibility of marketing expenses, and so where are these standing?
Yeah, so I'll deal with the first one first because I don't have a ton to say about that. I had looked into that a long time ago, and it seemed like a political no-go, the tax deductibility thing. I can't remember. I think this is not necessarily a legal reason, though I'm sure, as always, there would be legal arguments made, but my recollection is that there was just no political will to do that. So for those who, the marketing expenses are deductible for corporations, basically. So the idea was to change sort of the incentive structure to, if you get rid of that deduction, it becomes a lot more expensive for them to spend gazillions of dollars marketing. So no, but now you're making me want to dig back into that.
I also wondered, for example, in a state like California, could you not take a hit on that? I mean, so if they can deduct it, could we structure things in such a way that at least there's public money available to counter some of those messages that are deemed harmful and the state is paying for?
Yeah.
But I didn't know if there's any...
No, that's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. This is leading me to another point that we want to make in a minute, but let me answer your other question first, which is, so marketing to kids is problematic and has negative effects. It is also difficult. In part, it falls into the same sort of scheme as marketing more generally, which is you can divide up to the 4 Ps of marketing, and some of them are easier to do things about, like place and price, and others like promotion and direct advertisements to kids. I was just meeting with Lori Dorfman at BMSG about digital marketing. Some of that is more complicated to do something about. I think what you're getting at, and where there's been talk among advocates and legal scholars and people strategizing in the space for a while, is that there's something fundamentally different about marketing to kids specifically, and because of the misleading nature of it inherently, because of kids' cognitive abilities, which differ from those of adults, is there a way to sort of carve that out and say, yes, marketing in general is protected, but that particular type of marketing actually should not be protected by the First Amendment? So the rationale behind that is complicated, but part of it is that misleading or deceptive speech is not protected by the First Amendment. Now, you could also argue that like all marketing is misleading and deceptive, but it is particularly misleading and deceptive for kids. The problem that we as like a policy and advocacy community have had is drawing lines in a way that is like comports with the law, such that you're only prohibiting marketing to kids and not accidentally also sweeping in marketing to adults. So sort of the prototypical case for this from the Supreme Court is in a tobacco context. I'm going to forget the details, but the details don't matter. The basic premise was they had prohibited billboards like within X distance of, I think it was schools, and the purpose was to prevent kids from seeing these billboards. And what the court found was, yeah, like you're prohibiting kids from seeing it, but you're also sweeping in a huge number of adults here. And because for adults, this is a legal product, you can't have this regulation. I think there may be something there, and this is where I start to get out of my current league, though may develop some expertise in this shortly, is in the digital realm, where things are much more individually and specifically targeted in a way that the marketers know exactly who they're marketing to and are intending to reach that person and that person alone, and they know their age. So it may be easier to make some inroads there. The complication there is that the world of privacy and digital internet regulations is incredibly complicated, and also a lot of it, though certainly not all, is regulated at the federal level, which creates a political barrier, if not a legal barrier. That said, one of the things I was just talking to Lori about was, to the extent that they're doing like very place-based marketing, and you guys probably know more about this than I do, but you know, you walk into a store and there's like a beacon and it sends you a specific ad for the specific thing that you're standing next to, or you walk into McDonald's, like that stuff is all happening in the context of a specific city or state. And so in theory, without, you know, me knowing very much about this at all, there should be some like hook there for the city or state in which this is happening to do something about that. But that's about the extent of my knowledge in that space. So this is all a very long way of saying the legal climate is still very challenging. The line drawing is challenging, but it may be that there's some creative ways to start doing that as digital becomes more of a...
Can I just chime in?
Yeah,
the
please.
Last time I looked into this stuff, where we kept hitting was IRS and tax law. I mean, marketing is a legitimate business expense if the definition of your business is trying to sell something to make money, and it's built into your, I mean, that's the goal and purpose of your organization, is to sell things. So it was considered fiduciary impairment. I forget what the exact words were in tax law to try to limit, how could you limit marketing if by definition this organization is founded to sell things? And so we really quickly got into like these tax law problems.
It gets,
the last time I tried to get involved.
it gets very complicated very quickly.
Well, it's also interesting, just what you said, and thinking about in terms of the appetite with the recent announcement of considering, essentially considering shareholders' investments maybe not being the only primary.
Right.
That maybe those windows will open if there's a shift in the corporate cultural environment.
I think that's potentially true. I'm not going to hold my breath for that to happen, but yes, I think that is true.
You've spoken about how there is obviously an issue with corporations advertising and making the policies, and it seems like the solution is sort of like, well, we'll combat that with research, or that's one of the prongs. To what extent are they also putting out the research to counter the arguments that folks like you might come up with? Exactly. And how do you guys work around that?
Well, I don't know, are you guys familiar with the sugar documents library at UCSF? Yeah, so they are compiling a lot of this stuff. I mean, Marion Nestle has like an ongoing list of like corporate influenced research. I mean, we are careful about the source of the research that we rely on, for sure. And one of the things that I want to touch on before we run out of time is that I'm speaking for myself, but I'm guessing you and all my colleagues would agree that having open lines of communication between the policy community and the research community is super important for a whole number of reasons, like going back to the law, because it doesn't really make sense for you guys to be researching potential policy approaches that just are non-starters from a legal perspective, because oftentimes things like court cases, like in the sugary drink warning label context, for example, like the outcome of those court cases depends heavily and almost entirely on what the research says. And if there's not that communication going back and forth, then it's like we're wasting each other's time, we're not being as productive as we could, we're not arriving like at the outcomes we could as quickly as we could. So just this morning, in a perfect timing world, got an email from a researcher that works on sugary drink warning labels, trying to convene a working group of like sort of the main people working in policy in that space and the main people doing research in that space to have a regular like working group call, email list so that we're all in touch with each other. And I want to put to you as the research community or members of that community that is incredibly helpful for us as policy folks, and I hope that it also would be helpful for you guys to have people like us at the table to talk about sort of how we use research and what we need on our end, and sort of vice versa.
Yeah, I mean, in the context of like federal, like we're just seeing in federal assistance on SNAP, we're just seeing a constant attack on federal assistance programs. SNAP is the one that keeps coming up over and over again, and we, respond to that, but, know that, like, the more research and evidence we have, and even if we're responding within, like, the public comment process, that folks come back later and, whether or not the government does not have to take what we say and make any changes to their proposed rule, but those are often challenged later, so that having that research ready to go so that we can use it when we're challenging it as an advocacy organization, and then have the groups that are challenging it in the courts have that research available, and have, to counter either what is the industry research or just what the administration thinks should happen is really key for the work that we do.
We have just a couple more minutes before 12. This is being recorded, so you have to leave. We completely understand, but we can keep on going if anyone has any additional questions.
Well, I guess related to that, I'm curious, like, obviously we have to get funding to do research, but do you have, like, a short list of nutrition-related research questions you wish you had the answer to?
Oh, man. Yes, probably. Can we get back to you on that? I mean, but actually, since you brought that up and remind me of the kids' meal thing, so I would love to have the outcomes of that research. That is interesting to me, not only because it's a new policy, it's a new idea, we don't know what the effects of it are, and there could be effects, as you know, on many dimensions, purchasing, consumption, like knowledge, whatever it may be. But also, it helps us with if it's not being implemented, then another policy element is enforcement, and how can we think about better, either drafting better policies that include effective enforcement mechanisms that don't have unintended consequences as well, and, what's the point of passing a policy if it doesn't work? But in terms of a wish list, I don't have one off the top of my, I do have one in the I have many in the warning label context, and that is why I'm in touch with those folks that are doing that work, but generally I'd have to think about it for a little bit.
Well, I have one.
Go for it.
Something that I'm starting to look at in the nutrition assistance space, SNAP and WIC in particular, is a trauma-informed approach to social policy, and sort of taking from the trauma-informed care world and framework, and knowing that like both SNAP and WIC are tools and strategies in addressing trauma and preventing trauma in terms of food insecurity, and having, resources to meet your needs, but can also be trauma-inducing for many people on the individual level. Just, being on those programs, going into a WIC office, being on SNAP, being told, you're at the grocery store, take that out, sort of like how, and looking at how do we administer those programs and how do we create policy frameworks for those programs that are truly trauma-informed and not just the outcomes in terms of getting folks resources, but in how how people interact with them. And so I think there's not trauma-informed social policy in the food world is not very well studied. It comes up a lot in violence prevention. It comes up a lot in schools and ACEs, but in food sort of and how people interact with these programs, I think is a little lacking. So that's something that we're just digging into and are really interested in, and that has to do with choice and all that kind of stuff.
I'd love to talk to you about that. I wrote a Robert Wood Johnson ATR that did not get through, but anyway, starting to ask some of those questions. So,
all right.
We are thinking on that.
And then I have some really in-depth geeky questions about healthy default beverages, if you have a few minutes.
Yeah, sure.
I don't know if anybody
No
wants
problem. I'm happy to
to
chat.
listen to that.
Yeah, I'm happy to chat. I would just say, if you guys have ideas on how to actually facilitate better communication between the research community and the policy and advocacy community, I think it is happening randomly and in ad hoc ways, and that's better than not at all, but it would be great to have it happen in a more coordinated way. It would improve all of our lives, I think.
Well, I just want to thank you both for coming over and joining us during our brown bag. It was really informative, and we really appreciated it.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
To answer your last question, I think doing things like this is a good first step.
For sure.
Yeah, but we need to bigger summit.
I think it would be awesome to have regular sort of twice a year meetings, because we all go to our meetings and they're separate and we